Pin myself here. All right. Hello and welcome to the Parsha class, Parsha Vayakhel 5785. And what we have here is a Parsha that is often underestimated, let's call it. A lot of people ask, what can you possibly say that you haven't already said in the 3 hours worth of previous classes on this Parsha in other years? So the answer is, you'll see, we have quite a bit to say. There's a lot of interesting questions that are brought up, a lot of interesting, and I would venture to say, even possibly controversial things that happen in this week's Parsha, all of which is from the Torah, from H-Shem, and all of which is supposed to help us grow closer to H-Shem and enjoy our lives more in this world and in the next. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. We're going to start with the first verse. Let's look at the source sheet we've got here, sent out by email earlier today. And here we go. The first verse, first word, literally that the parsha gets its name from, comes from the first two verses of the Torah. Vayakhel Moshe et kol adat b'nei Yisrael. Moshe gathered the entire group, the entire congregation of all the Jewish people. Vayomer alehem, and he said to them, these are the words that Hashem commanded for you to do. So he's about to tell them, you're going to build the Mishkan. And what does he do? Not that. Not build the Mishkan. Instead, he says, Sheshet yamim ta'aseh melacha. For 6 days, you're going to do work. Uvayom hashvi'i yelachem kodesh kodesh. And then the seventh day is going to be holy for you. Shabbat Shabbaton LaHashem. It is a Sabbath to Hashem. Now, this is not our first mention of Shabbat. According to Chazal, first of all, besides the fact that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov kept Shabbat, that in some sense, Adam HaRishon knew about Shabbat. Here we have Shabbat being mentioned like it's brand new. We've never heard of it before. It was in the Ten Commandments. That was a few parshas ago. According to Chazal, the Jews were commanded to keep Shabbat even before they got to Har Sinai. And according to Chazal, also the Jewish people kept Shabbat in Mitzrayim, or tried to. It is very unusual that it's being mentioned here as if it's something brand new, and more importantly, out of context, because we're about to get the command to build the Mishkan, and instead we're told, do work for 6 days, and on the seventh day you shall rest, right? Because it's a holy day for Shabbat. Shabbat Shabbaton LaHashem, kol ha'oseh melacha yumat. Anybody who does work on Shabbat will get the death penalty. Of course, with witnesses and criminal investigation and all that other stuff. It's not just like we see you working on Shabbat, so we stone you to death on the spot. That's not how that works. There's accidental, and then there's on purpose, and then there's trying to upset Hashem, or whatever different reasons people had for breaking Shabbat, all mentioned there. So just to... We'll talk about other explanations also, but it's important to notice that it's not so weird, really, if you think about it, that Shabbat is mentioned alongside the Mishkan, because we know that keeping Shabbat means to not transgress the 39 melachot, the 39 forbidden actions. Where do we get these 39 forbidden actions? What are these 39 forbidden actions? Those are the 39 actions used to build the Mishkan. So don't do that on Shabbat. Do everything else. Anything else that's not in the building of the Mishkan, those are the things you can do on Shabbat in theory. So it's really not completely out of, halachically speaking, not completely out of thin air. And of course, the next verse, as we're going to see very shortly, Moshe gets right into the workings of the Mishkan, into how the Mishkan is to be built. But first, he gathers all the people. Now, let's talk about that in a little more detail here. Why is it gathering all of the people? We've mentioned in previous years that it's a very. There are other commentaries on this, by the way. Obviously, I direct you to our YouTube channel where we have several years of classes on the subject, and there are a number of reasons why he gathered all the people. But it's a really good question if you think about it, because really and truly, when I want something done, if I have a job I want done, do I gather everybody together, or do I choose the people I think will actually do it? In other words, the very exclusive team of people, and I assign work. If they say, like in an emergency situation, God forbid, we shouldn't know of such things. But if you're present when an emergency happens, you're not supposed to, say, "Hey, somebody call 911." You're supposed to point and say, "You call 911. You do this. You do that." You're supposed to assign jobs to people. But this isn't what Moshe's doing. Moshe's literally picking up a microphone, a megaphone, and saying, "Hey, y'all, we're making the Mishkan. Just assign the work already instead." So what's the purpose of gathering everybody together? So there's, like I said, a few commentaries on this. Today we're going to learn from the words of the great Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky in Emet LeYaakov. So there he says, you have to understand there's a context here. The building of the Mishkan was not in a bubble. There's a reason why we built the Mishkan, and the reason has a lot to do with the Egel, the golden calf. In last week's parsha, we learned about the sin of the golden calf, and we know that they did the wrong thing. We know that they transgressed. We know that they separated themselves from H-Shem and went onto, let's call it spiritually, a lower level. But what else did they do? Says Rav Yaakov, Ha'egel haya ha'hefech shel matan Torah. In a sense, what they did by worshiping the idol, the golden calf, is they ruined, they switched around the greatness that they gained by receiving the Torah earlier in the Torah. Right? They got in Parsha Yitro, they got the Ten Commandments, they had Matan Torah, they saw Hashem's greatness, as it were, and at that point, something happened to the Jewish people. What happened? Says Rabbi Yaakov, Ki b'Matan Torah, it says in the Midrash, in the Mechilta, Amru Razal, V'yichan Yisrael ki ish echad b'lev echad. When we gathered at Har Sinai, we were like one unified whole. We were united, like the Jewish people have never been before, and perhaps never have been since. V'kan Amru b'Yerushalmi, and it happens to say in the Yerushalmi, in Sanhedrin there, Ki Yud Gimel Agalot Nasu. The Jewish people had 12 for each tribe, as it were, had its own Egel Hazahav. Of course, we know, by the way, Levi did not have an Egel Hazahav, so this isn't to be taken probably literally. This is metaphoric. The point is that they were the way Avodah Zarah works, and I believe there's a story about Rabbi Yehonatan Eibschutz about this, if I'm not mistaken. I think there's a story about him. It could be somebody else. We'll have to do some research. But the story goes that somebody, he had dealings with the Prussian royalty, nobility, and there was a noble who came up to him and said, you Jewish people, you have a concept of going after the majority. The majority of people aren't Jewish, so you shouldn't be Jewish. Follow the majority. Be Christian like the rest of us. Right, in Europe, everybody's 90-something% Christian, right? So that's not the case anymore, by the way. But back then, the story goes, he looked at him and said, "But are all of you the same kind of Christian?" Right? Do all of you worship your God the same way? And already by then, this was, after the War of the Roses and the wars between England and France, Catholicism and Protestantism and Calvinism and the two different Catholicisms already by that time. When it comes to other religions, there's such a fracturing that there isn't one way to worship. With Hashem, there's only one way to worship Hashem. Oh, you're going to say, wait, Hasidim and Misnagdim and Sephardim, Ashkenazim, Teimani. So there's different way to pronounce words, and there might be different words in the siddur here and there. But we all believe in one God. We all keep Shabbat. We're all going to keep, we're not going to eat chametz on Pesach, right? Anybody who's observant keeps the basics the same exact way. It's not like, Christmas or Xmas, whatever you want to call it, where they celebrate literally on different days of the year, right? Or the Gregorian calendar, the Julian calendar, and everything else. We've got one day. We've got the days of Pesach. We have one day a week, Shabbat. We all keep the same way. There's 3 times a day the Jewish men daven. There's the tefillin that we all put on. Our way of serving God is unified, and so we don't have to follow the majority if the majority is all mishkabubble, right? So that's the point here. The Jewish people were unified when we got the Torah and became disunified, became separated, and became very different from each other when it came to worshiping this idol, this golden calf. And then the point, V'harei mitzinu ahale Moav ale Edom k'dom, V'harei rak Elokim achirim, they had like different gods, etc., right? Elohim achirim. Right, so each tribe had their own ideas of how they're going to worship this golden calf. Therefore, Moshe lahazir et Yisrael al Mishkan, when Moshe came to give them the rules to really start them up, to pull the pin, to pull the cord and let them start working on the Mishkan. That's Haita Avodato Harishona Lahakil et Ha'am. That's the first job they had, united as a people. The Mishkan's job, so this is fascinating with the way he says it. So what he's saying is a beautiful idea. The work of the Mishkan, Moshe had to gather everybody together. You know why? Because that's the job of the Mishkan. Worshipping Hashem in one proper way is what unifies us as a Jewish people. Think about that for today especially. There's so many different ways that people think that they were being Jewish, wearing a Batman costume to remember the Bibas family, or wearing red. How about learning Torah? How about keeping mitzvot? How about unifying as a Jewish people by doing what Jewish people have always done, and will always do? Batman is a character that will be as forgotten as the characters from Vanity Fair 100 years ago. Batman will be forgotten also in 100 years. But Judaism and Torah, that's going to stay. So that's what we need to focus on. And that is that's Rabbi Yaakov. So again, we're about to get into building the Mishkan, but then the Torah, since we mentioned that we have to keep Shabbat, the Torah gives you one example of how to keep Shabbat. Lo tevaru eish b'chol moshvotechem b'yom haShabbat. Chapter 35, verse 3. The very next verse says, "You may not light a fire where you live on Shabbat." Shkoyach. Thank you, Torah. I didn't know that. Of all the 39 melachot, you decided to choose one and focus on that one. So why fire? Why not don't carry? Why not don't erase, don't break, don't build, don't put things through a sieve? There's so many. There's 39. Why focus on only one? So there are halachic reasons. There's certain things we can learn from this verse that can be reapplied to the other 39 malachot. There's such a concept in the 13 methods that Rabbi Yishmael mentions that we say every morning. The 13 methods of exegesis of how the rabbis can extrapolate Torah law from the Torah. And one of the methods is that we can take a thing, if one particular detail is mentioned about it, we can pull it out and then learn other things about it, as we're going to see. But there's other reasons perhaps why fire is used as an example. And just because there's a lot of commentary on this, we're going to look at 3 commentaries from 2 people. The first we're going to look at Rav Hirsch. So why is fire singled out? So he says at first glance, kindling fire seems to be not a creative activity, but a destructive activity. So that's perhaps one reason why fire is being used, because fire isn't usually for building. Fire is for destroying. On the other hand, it is precisely the ability to produce fire artificially that gives man his true mastery over the physical world. How? Only by means of fire can he make his tools and probe into the inner nature of the materials, separate them and fashion them. Hence, we can understand why our verse singles out Havara as a category of melacha from among all the other avot melachot. So, avot melacha. So, according to Rav Hirsch, the reason why we're singling out fire is because you might have thought that fire is not really a fitting melacha, because we don't build with it. But we do, because you can't have tools without fire. So how are you going to build without a hammer if you can't make yourself a hammer? Right? You need to burn things. You need to create ore. You need to play around with fire to bend the metals to be the shape and the strength you need it to have. Okay, so that's one thing. But more than that, here's the halacha. Right, according to the other opinion, which is the one accepted by the halacha, Havara lechalek yotzat, Havara serves as a model for all of the other malachot, in accordance with the hermeneutical principle that I mentioned before. Davar shaya bechalal yatsa min haklal lelamed, lo lelamed al atzmo yatsa, elo lelamed al haklal kulo yatsa. That's what that one of the 13 principles that I just mentioned from Rabbi Yishmael. In other words, where something is included in a general statement and is then singled out and made the subject of a specific statement, what is specifically stated is not limited to it itself, but rather applies to the whole general statement. In other words, everything that's true about not making fire on Shabbat applies to all of the other 38 melachot on Shabbat. In other words, this means that for all forms of the Isur Melacha on Shabbat indicated by Ele Hadvarim of verse 1, the sanctity of Shabbat is applied independently for each one of the prohibited Melachot. As a result, if one inadvertently, bishgaga, performs several different Melachot on Shabbat, then to attain atonement, one must bring as many Chatot as Melachot performed. In other words, if you used a sieve and started a fire and built a wall, right? All 3 things, whatever, and you erased, so 4 things. You have to bring 4 sin offerings. For example, here's his example, if you don't like mine. Right? For example, if one inadvertently plows, sows, and cuts corn on Shabbat, one is obligated to bring a chatat for each category of melacha. In other words, 3, in that case, chataot. This is called Chiluk Malachot b'Shabbat, and it is this Isur Malacha on Shabbat, and in this, the Isur Malacha on Shabbat differs characteristically from that on Yom Tov. Yesh Chiluk Malachot b'Shabbat, ve'ein Chiluk Malachot b'Yom Tov. It says in the Gemara in Makot 21b, cessation of work on Yom Tov is a logical extension of the concept of Moed. The avodat Hashem to which we are called by the Moed precludes malacha avoda. melechet avoda. You wouldn't do it. There's no reason to, because you have this holiness of moed. You have all the obligations and responsibilities of moed. You wouldn't. The idea of working on a holiday is so antithetical to the holiday itself. This is an overarching concept which is impinged upon equally by every melacha. By contrast, cessation of work on Shabbat is the acknowledgement that man's ability to master the physical world is granted to him by God, and he should be used only in his service. In other words, there's a reason why we don't do melacha on Shabbat, and this is something Rav Hirsch says in many different places. But the idea is that when we don't do work on Shabbat, we're basically saying that work is for the purpose of Hashem. And if he says not to work, don't work. This acknowledgement comes to expression independently in every single category of such mastery. And that work means every single one of those 39 different kinds of jobs. So every one of those jobs that we don't do on Shabbat proves that there's a God in the world who can control us, who can feed us, and whom we serve by not doing melacha when he tells us not to do melacha. He concludes, Shabbat is not desecrated in relation to the various elements of the physical world, but in relation to the various malachot. For example, if a person performs the melacha of ktsira, in other words, cutting down on wheat, grapes, and apples, he brings only one chatat. He did only one thing. He reaped. He reaped 3 different things, but he reaped. That's all he did. Whereas if he performs 3 malachot in a wheat field, he brings 3 chataot. If he does 3 different jobs, each one of those jobs requires a sin offering. The implication is that the concept of Shabbat is not to be understood as subordination of the physical world to God, but as subordination of man to God as regards the physical world. In other words, we're not saying the earth belongs to God, or we say that in other ways, but not on Shabbat. What we're saying is we belong to God, and we have to do these 3 things in order, or not do these 3 things in order to listen to what he told us to do. Okay. Very different answers are given for the same question by the Chatam Sofer. Rather contemporary, actually, a little bit earlier than Rav Hirsch, but nevertheless, 2 ideas from him, both of which are very unique and very beautiful. One is actually, I don't usually mention this, but one of them is my weekly video that I make. Is the second one here. But anyway, let's get right into it. You shall not start a fire in your dwelling places. Ramzu shelo yichos v'yivar eish hakas b'Shabbat. Ayin b'shlah. He quotes the Shlah, the Shnei Luchot Habrit, who writes that the Yetzer Hara wants us to fight. The Ben Ish Chai, by the way, mentions that from the Zohar, I believe, that there's a great reward to not fight on Erev Shabbat. Erev Shabbat, there's a tension, there's a lot of stress, a lot of things need to get done, and there might be a lot of reason to be upset with your partner, with your wife, spouse, whatever it is, with your children. Do not get angry, says the Ben Ish Chai. The same reason is here. So it says the Chatam Sofer, don't start a fire on Shabbat. Shabbat should not be a time when there's arguments and machloket and punishments and all these other things. And so he's using this as a remez, as a hint to this idea. Don't start any fires, meaning physical, not physical fire, but here we're talking about emotional fires on Shabbat. And on a very, very unique but very different note, he also says, in another year, he said, Lo tevaru eish b'chol moshvatehem b'yom HaShabbat, ki maharui sheb'kol hashavua shtiyeh eish ha'ahava udveikut b'Hashem, bor b'libo. Your fire should not only start. not only the word only is important here. You shouldn't only start your fire on Shabbat. Your love and connection, your dveikut, your attachment to Hashem should not only be on Shabbat. Because Shabbat is a holy day, and a lot of people act a lot more Jewish on Shabbat, and that's fine. But that shouldn't preclude you. That's not mutually exclusive from how Jewish you should be on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and the rest, the rest of the days of the week. In other words, are not unholy. Shabbat isn't the only day to have that fire and that brin, that desire to be close to Hashem. That should be every day of the week, says the Khatam Sofer. And that's what it says here, that not just in terms of melacha, but also in terms of Kiddusha, your holiness. That should not only be on Shabbat. You shouldn't start being Jewish only on Shabbat. Yes, be more Jewish if you want, but there should be that kind of enthusiasm for Yiddishkeit and your connection to Hashem year-round, week-long. Not a single day should go by without you being close to Hashem. Okay, we're going to skip quite a few verses now. So the Jewish people are told to build the Mishkan, and they go off to do their different works. They're reminded again what exactly they have to do. Beautiful. Chapter 35, verse 21 says, "Ve'avo kol ish asher nesao libo." Every person who had whose heart told him to. Was inspired by his heart. Asher nidava rucho, who was generous of spirit. Oto heviu et trumat Hashem. He gave a gift of Hashem. This is going to be part of the commentary that we're about to see. L'melechet ohel moed, to the work of the ohel moed, the work of the tent of meeting. V'chol avodato u'legabe hakodesh, and for all of the other work, and for the bigdei hakodesh, levigdei hakodesh, and for the clothing, the holy clothing of the kohanim. So it sounds like, if you look at it carefully, it sounds like there's two different kinds of people in the world. There's kol ish asher yinasau libo, everybody who is inspired by his heart. And then later it says, Ota heviu et trumat Hashem l'melechat avoda, and people who donated for the work of the work, for the melacha, for the Ol Moed. So which is it? Is it two separate groups? So says the Or HaChaim, yes, indeed, it is two separate groups. Duh. You should know. Ki yesh shtei hadragot b'mit nadchim. There's two different kinds of mitnadchim, mitnadvim, donors or volunteers. Ha'alef, the first category, hu hanit mitnadev birtzon nafsho k'ti yicholto erech mamono. Somebody who just wants to give as much as he has. He knows how much he has. He's done the cheshbon. He's got money to spare. And instead of using that money for his own benefit, he's going to give for a cause. Lishlol she'eno osa b'dvar kimo sha'ar b'nafsho. So he's not upset about this. He's perfectly happy. He's very generous. He wants to give. V'hasheni, and this second group, hu hamitnadev yoter micholato migodo tuviot libo. The second group of people is a type of person who wants to give more than he can, more than he should, perhaps. He wants to give. He wants to give and give and give nonstop. And this is the person that this verse calls a nisao libo, that his heart inspired him. Nisao libo perish shehalev minnaseu. His heart has lifted him up. His heart is pushing him, pulling him, lifting him up, flying him. He's directed by his heart. And he feels like his heart's telling him that he's richer than he is. You think you only have $200 to give? You're going to give $300. You're richer than you thought. And what our verse is telling us here is that the Jewish people acted this way. That it starts out with the holier one of the higher level of these two. Amar kol isha shenasau libo, because it mentions first it says that every man whose heart inspired him. V'digdek lomar tevat ish, and that's why it says. That's why it specifically uses the word ish. Lashon chashivut. Ish is a special word. There are a lot of words for man in Hebrew. Ish means somebody who's a higher level, higher class, right? As opposed to an enosh or an adam. An ish is a chashuv ish, right? The Gemara Megillah talks about this. And regarding that second category, who gave generously, no problem with that. So about them, the Torah says, it says that everyone who's ruach, who was inspired to do it, doesn't mention Leib, and as the Orach Chaim points out, v'lo amar ish. It doesn't call this a man. It just calls, as it says, chol, all who were also inspired. So there, it's not, the person is not doing more than they can, doing more than they thought they could. They're doing exactly what they wanted to give. They're giving generously and lovingly, but it's not more than they could have. So in conclusion, almost, he says, from all of this, you can glean this important lesson. When in all situations, especially here in the Mishkan, there's always two levels, specifically here, sorry. It's not always the case. I wish it was always the case. When it came to the Mishkan, there were two levels. And both of them are great. Shenadvu bilibam, they gave, and they gave with their hearts. V'lo asu davar b'chesron ratzon halev, and nobody did it because nobody was forced to do it. Nobody did it reluctantly. Ela she'echad gadol mechavera, but one is greater than the other. The first one is greater than the other because it's greater to give. It's greater to give. It's greater to give more than you thought you could give. He continues here, and we're not going to be able to say very much about this. This is a Kabbalistic idea that he talks about, and he references something he said on back in the 5th verse of this parak. We didn't learn it here today, but it's Perik Lamed Hey Pasuk Hey. So over there, again, we're not going to get into great detail, but he mentions that when it comes to this idea of generosity and how willingly you do a mitzvah, it has a different kind of effect in the spiritual world. That's what makes it Kabbalistic. Usually when they talk about, oh, it's Kabbalistic, it doesn't mean we don't understand it. It means it requires a little more one-on-one sort of hashing it out to get really an idea of what he's talking about better. But what we can say is that he says that there's different spiritual effects to how this mitzvah is done. Do we affect the spiritual world? So according to Kabbalistic thought, yes, we do. Do we change Hashem? God forbid. Hashem is unchangeable. But the pipeline through which bracha comes into the world from Hashem can become more or less clogged by our good or bad behavior. God forbid, bad behavior. So that's based on that. The more generous we are, the more open that pipeline of bracha is, and the more the spiritual world will be noticeable in this physical world. That's what it means. He says more on this, obviously, and it's not my place to talk about these things, but that's more or less what he goes on there. Okay, we're going to skip another 12 verses of 10 and 11, 11 more verses to chapter 35, verse 32. Is that right? Oh, that's weird. Sort of out of order. Let's go to verse 35, verse 26. Let's just stay in order. Everybody gets to work. Everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing. The woodworkers are working with the wood. The metal workers are working with the metal. And the women are doing the sewing. That was a skill they had back at the time of Mitzrayim. And now they're going to use that skill for the purpose of the Mishkan. And yes, every woman who could was involved in building the Mishkan, just like every man. And it says in chapter 35, verse 26, that Kol hanashim asher nasa libam otana b'chachma tavu et ha'izim. Each woman who was given the skill was able to spin the goat's hair. So says the Gemara, says the Midrash, says many of the commentaries that the skill was not just simple, just like weaving goat's hair, because anybody can do that. Well, not everybody, I can't. But back then, I'm sure more people were able to have that skill. They knew how to weave much better. But they wove this goat skin et ha'izim from literally the goat itself. The goat was just standing there. The woman went with her needles and whatever and started weaving straight off of the goat. Was able to weave these beautiful parochet, the beautiful curtains for the Mishkan. And the question is why? What would be the purpose? There are a number of answers. Again, this is one of those questions that has a lot of the commentaries scratching their heads and trying to find an answer. You could say that I believe I heard in the name of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibschutz again. Right, heard he had an explanation that had to do with the halacha of nida. So the women were concerned that perhaps if they were menstrual, if they had nida coming on, then they might affect the thing that they're making, and that thing would become tameh, would become impure. And we want the Mishkan, at least essentially, initially for sure, to be pure, 100% pure. So the women were concerned about whether they could do that or not, and still have a pure Mishkan. So they decided to get the goat's hair right off of the animal. And that would not be a problem of nida, because you can't make an animal, a living animal, can't become tameh of nida by being touched by a nida. So So that being the case, they made these sheets, they made these curtains in a pure way. So that's a little bit deeper answer, perhaps, but there's also a very simple answer. And for the simple answer, we're going to look at the Maskil Le David, Rav David Pardo of 18th century Italy, and happens to be one of my daughters in Italy right now on a school trip. So Italy's on my mind, at least she is. And so let's, in honor of the trip, let's quote the Maskil David. So um, so Tavu Umanot Yitera, they were able to do this amazing, almost magical work of skinning, of taking the fur, the goat's hair right off of the goat, immediately onto the tapestries. What's the reason for this? Hatam. So his reason is lefi shelo hayu tzvoot. The goat's hair is white. Lekach hayu tzrichot kach shehatzemer o tzir az naki ma'od. They wanted it to be pretty. They wanted it to be clean. And if you're going to these other things, they were colored in purple, red dye, whatever, all these other colors. But this goat's hair needed to be white and needed to be clean. So nakim ma'od she'enu mitlachal mitlach, and so it wouldn't be dirty. Mishmush, that's being dragged around, being on the floor, and everything else being worked on. Aval briot tachtonot hatzemer tzvua lo hutzruchu lach. So the other things, the purple, other colors didn't need this kind of cleanliness. It's hard to see dirt on darker colors, but white dirt shows up much more easily. And so there is that concern. Okay, and what were the men doing meanwhile? So they were working, like I said, with the other materials. So chapter 35, verse 32 says that some of the other materials were la'achshov machshava la'asot b'zahav u'b'kesef v'nechoshet. And this is describing specifically Betzalel, who was amongst the Jewish people. He was the supervisor. He was the man in charge, the project manager, if you will, of the Mishkan. And so he had to make sure that people were able to work with Zahav, with Kesef, and the Choshet. And the Ibn Ezra says, what's that first word? Velachshov, that they were inspired. What does that mean? Belibo, in their heart. Machshavat shelo niru kemotan. They were able to do things that they might have never seen before. Right? They were slaves in Egypt. They weren't worksmen. They didn't do weaving with gold and silver threads. Right? They didn't know how to do this kind of metal work and gemology and everything else. Kish and zahav velo kesef. There's people who are expert in gold, but not expert in silver. V'charshe evan velo eitz. People who know how to work with stone, but not with woodwork. V'kulam hayu shalim, and they all worked together. Everybody who needed to had the skills they needed to have in order to make this happen. Okay, so that's the Ibn Ezra. The Chidushei Lev wants us to learn a lesson from this. What's the point of teaching us that? Why does H-Shem make these kinds of things happen? That He inspires people to work and know how to do all these different things. So the Chidushei Lev, by the way, is Rav David Leibowitz, Zecher Tzadok Livracha, Rosh Shiva of Chavetz Chaim. And he quotes the Ibn Ezra, as we just did. Again, that he's basically talking about how great Betzalel must have been in order to supervise all of this. So he says, "Bir ha'even ezer sheya efshari shelemara sheBetzalel haya milo b'chachma u'b'tvuna." With that, we already know that Betzalel was given, Torah itself tells us that he was given wisdom and knowledge, etc. Afilu hachi lo yada kiyetzer ketzad lilamed. But we don't know what that means. The al nemar bo shavach nosef sheyada gam ketzad lilamed. Gam katav ha'even Ezra. שישנם הרבה חכמים ומלאים חכמה, תבונה ודעת, איך אינם יכולים להורות לאחרים. You can have a lot of different geniuses, and they won't know how to work together. Bir hadvarim, he wants to explain, כי ללמד לאחרים היא אומנות חכמה ומיוחדת. Knowing how to supervise one person and working with other people is also a skill. Being a project manager is also a skill. You're working with a bunch of geniuses, a bunch of people who know how to do one thing pretty well. To get them to all work together, also a skill. I feel inyan lamed beumanos shapulo to gashmiut kagon laasod bezahav kesav v'dachosha. Even working with physical things. I feel lezeh katav ha'even Ezra. Zakuk milamed l'chachma miyuchedet. So you need a special skill for that. Al achad kama v'kama, kol v'chomer, l'lamed Torat Hashem. People who learn to Hashem, lahadri, lahachdir, yashud, maseichav, tor halev. They have to be straightforward and have to have. They have to learn Torah honestly, with intellectual honesty and with a desire for the right things, to get closer to Hashem, to change themselves. Musagim daikim v'adainim. So they have to be people who are, working with these kinds of people who might be geniuses too. You have in any given yeshiva, you'll have you'll have a share of brilliant minds. But to work with them and to be able to make one unified whole, like it says, like we said it earlier about the parsha, that Moshe gathered the Jewish people, that kind of unity. To have that, Melamed zakuk lishtamesh betachbulot shonot. You have to use all of your skills, all these different kinds of abilities that different scholars might have, the different kinds of geniuses are smart in different ways. You have to find a way to put all of that together. Yes, a bit of an essay here, but the point is, and he quotes other kinds of brilliant minds of Torah history. Moshe Rabbeinu, the wisest of all men, Shlomo HaMelech. Moshe Rabbeinu hutzrach lishtamesh b'mtzaot v'tarbulot shonot k'dei lelamed Torah l'dor dea. Moshe had to have different ways to approach the different geniuses of the generation of knowledge, the people who got the Torah, dor dea. V'gam Shlomo HaMelech tiken tarbulot k'dei lelamed al yadam la'adam. Even the wisest of all men, Shlomo, had to find a way to transfer that knowledge to other people. Shir Hashirim isn't the same as Mishlei. It's not the same as Kohelet. These are different works because they have to approach different people in different ways to get your wisdom, to get your Torah into their heads. If you don't do that, there's not going to be a way to transfer your brilliant knowledge in your Torah to the next group. This is a lesson for all of us, not just for Rosh Yeshiva, but for all of us who have children or have people whom we want to inspire, that we need to have a way to approach them, a way to be able to transfer the Torah that we've learned to the next group, so that Torah will continue forever. Last thought of the evening for this year. Chapter 37, verse 1. V'yas Betzalel et ha'aron atzei shitim, amatayim chetzi v'arko v'ama v'chetzi rachbo v'ama v'chetzi komato. And this is the beginning. Chapter 37 is really a list of all the things that Betzalel made. Starts with Betzalel made the ark of acacia wood, 2.5 amot long, to amma and a half wide, amma and a half high. Okay, just like it's been commanded back in Parshat Truma. Nothing spectacular about that. Unless you might have missed what I just said, which is that Betzalel is credited with making everything. I just gave you an almost hour class about how all of the Jewish people were involved in building this. The women with the weaving, the men with the woodwork and the stone cutting and the metal work. But now Betzalel gets all the credit? Why is that? So says Rashi, Lefi shenata nafsho al melacha yoter mishar chachamim nikrait al shemo, because Betzalel gave of his soul. He gave his blood, sweat, and tears. He gave his soul for this work. That's why it's given his name. Given his name by whom? By H-Shem. H-Shem stamped his name on it. Says Reb Moshe Sternbach in Tam V'dat. Moshe Sternbach Shlita, should live and be well. Quotes the Midrash Rabbah, which is basically Rashi. The Rashi's quote. That Lefi shenata nafsho alav nikra al shemo. Hainu, he says, ki ha'aron kodesh kedoshim hu hutzrach lahavin ma'asiyato kavanot miyuchadot. You need to have special kavanot, you need to have special intent when you did it. U'Betzalel be'atzmo hutzrach la'asoto. And Betzalel had the right kavanah. He had the right concentration. He made it happen. And he always was thinking what it was supposed to do, and he did it right. And he gave up his life as is fitting for such a project. And that's why it's named after him. Teaching us what? Shekain hu hadavar sheha'adam asher bone yeshiva ubeit hamidrash Mahono o al yidei shemekabetz b'cherim u'moser nafsho al kiyuma nikrat hayeshiva al shemo. When somebody struggles and works at creating a yeshiva or a place to learn or a place to daven, we can add, and he does it all. He gives of himself 100%. There might be other people involved. There probably are. No one person can build anything on his own. Ask the Amish, right? Nobody can build a house on their own. Not really. Well, you can also ask, I guess, Robinson Crusoe. And even he needed Friday. So here you have a person who dedicates all of his life to build this thing, almost willing to almost give up his life for it. The yeshiva is named after him. You can have all the plaques you want. You can have all the names you want all over the place. This door is dedicated for the Schwartz family, and this corridors in the Goldstein family, and this bathroom urinal is the Rosenzweigenstein family. Right? You can go, everything's named after somebody, but the yeshiva will be blank's yeshiva. It will be Reb Chaim Volozhner's yeshiva. He gave of himself. Reb Meir Shapiro's yeshiva. Call it Chachmei Lublin if you like. Reb Meir Shapiro's yeshiva. He's the one who went around the world collecting and making this happen. Who had the dream and made it, brought it through to fruition. But if, God forbid, Aval im noten nedav yeshiva rak avor sheshemo yidno says al luach hayeshiva. But if he's only doing this so his name will be on a plaque somewhere in the yeshiva, lo yisko she'enu noten nafsho alav. He will not be remembered for giving his soul for it. V'dafka, and it might have his name on it, but everybody's just going to pass it by, and no one's going to notice that. Because if he did it for self-aggrandizement, that's all it was. It's all about himself. V'dafka im noten b'chol libo l'shem shamayim. Only if he gives it of his entire heart and for the sake of heaven, azai nikrahu be'emet al shemo. Only then will it really be known by his name. Only then. What a lesson! What a great way to really finish off the parsha as we're about to finish Sefer Shemot altogether. This week we get to read also Parshat Para. So many important lessons about how to behave and how to focus on others and how to really stress ourselves and push ourselves for the sake of Shemayim. If we're able to do that, we will have much more of a fire inside, not just on Shabbat, but all the days of the week and all the days of our life. Ad 120 Shana. Have a good rest of your week.